Trump and his tariffs, will it lead to a third world war? Now, that was a very disturbing thought that kept popping up as I started talking to people and researching for my latest article in the Week magazine on Trump's tariffs and what it means for the US and India. One of the people I spoke to was Mark Linscott, senior advisor with the US India Strategic Partnership Forum. Mark compared what's happening right now and how the whole world order is being reworked and the eerie similarities it had to what was happening between the two world wars back in the last century, leading up to the Second World War. Will history repeat itself? Let's be optimistic. But on the same note, Linscott also had a lot of insightful observations on how the US also needs the India trade deal as much as India wants it to escape the reciprocal tariffs that are supposed to be imposed from April 2nd.
To start with, I spoke to a few trade experts and economists and all that back here in India. So many of them were of the opinion that this could actually be a blessing in disguise that will help the Indian economy reform faster. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective. It certainly would be an ideal scenario. In fact, that's kind of the best case scenario, that there is impetus to advance the negotiations, to make progress, and even conclude an agreement as a vehicle in some respects for reforms that might be desirable and might make a lot of sense for India's development and the growth of the economy. For example, there have been a lot of issues on the trade front related to India's alignment with best global practices and using international standards for certain goods, and allowing for testing more globally rather than strictly in India. Reform in this area, I think, would be very helpful. In fact, make India much more competitive globally if it were adopting international standards more widely. Intellectual property rights. I mean, this is an area that's definitely going to be part of a negotiation for a bilateral trade agreement. India has made some significant steps in recent years to reform, for example, patent laws, to move further along, with the impetus being negotiations on a bilateral trade agreement, could be quite significant, particularly in the research and development side, the development of innovative pharmaceuticals, for example. India's been highly successful with generics. This seems to be a moment when it's beginning to move into more innovative drugs, and IPR reform could speed that along. And then, most importantly, tariffs. India does have quite high tariffs. I mean, that's well known globally. Lowering tariffs, while difficult politically, can help certain industries by having more opportunities, more choices for inputs, for machinery to manufacture, could be very beneficial to the Indian economy.
Right. India obviously had historically a lot of high tariffs, but then you could say there was a political reason to it, but there was also an economic and a social reason for it, because it is a nation in which a huge number of people are involved in low-level labor. So that was probably the argument which kind of stood till now. So now, of course, the situation right now calls for drastic measures, but given that, do you think it will be a massive churn kind of a thing, a major chaos, or something like that we could expect once, suppose, the government goes in for that kind of a drastic reform? Do you kind of foresee that, or do you think the ecosystem will adapt pretty smoothly?
Well, I think it depends on what's on the table, what can be negotiated, what degree of tariff cuts, tariff liberalization might be possible. Certainly, looking at a scenario at the potential for U.S. reciprocal tariffs that could be applied to Indian exports, perhaps even an Indian response of retaliatory tariffs. That's not good for anybody, and ideally can be avoided. Certainly, cutting tariffs in any country comes at a political cost. I mean, it can be quite sensitive for certain sectors. I mean, we certainly experienced that in the United States. I mean, you have situations in which the steel industry has been benefiting from protection for some years, certainly since the first Trump administration, and continues to advocate for more tariffs, certainly not lifting any of those tariffs. So it's difficult. But certainly the ideal scenario is that they can reach a tariff deal. It may take more than this week. I mean, negotiations are taking place this week. It may take more time than 3 or 4 days. Perhaps they can get halfway there, and that might be enough so that the Trump administration decides to delay imposition of reciprocal tariffs to allow more time for comprehensive negotiations. I certainly hope that would be the case. Ultimately, I think it could benefit India just in terms of its overall growth, but the steps potentially taken to reduce tariffs can lead to political churn. I mean, that's a bit unavoidable. Certainly Prime Minister Modi has shown himself to be remarkably savvy with political constituencies, and if any leader can do it, I expect he is one who could.
Right. This, of course, the political cost and, of course, the labor and the wider market, the businesses out there, like agriculture, for example, and other labor-intensive sectors like textiles. But then taking a step back, I think it could also benefit the Indian consumer in the short term, if not in the long term. What do you feel? I mean, it could actually open the Indian market to a lot of products, at least from the American side, which could probably be cost effective. Do you think such a scenario is possible?
Yeah, I do. It depends on the sector. And certainly I do want to emphasize the negotiation should be a two-way street. And India has its own interest in the US market, and it should effectively advocate for those interests. And I'm confident that that will happen. But just an example I know fairly well is in the medical devices sector. And there are tariffs. They're not prohibitively high tariffs, but they are significant. There can be regulatory measures in place that do restrict the access for particularly the high-end, more high-tech, innovative medical devices, which make it more difficult to trade in the Indian market. And certainly some lifting of those barriers could have real impacts for Indian consumers. Certainly in terms of access to the best products out there. And when health is at issues, any consumer wants the best potential treatment that is available. So, I think that's just one example where there could be benefits for consumers.
Okay. Now, if you step back from the India-US tariff and the whole situation, see, the fact is that India is just one piece in a chessboard full of moves that the US has initiated. And there are tariffs and other measures aimed at a lot of other major economies. Now, stepping back and looking at the overall picture, how far-reaching would all this be? What would be the kind of impact? Are we looking at a major rewiring of the global the way things are done, not just trade, but even bilateral relations and geostrategic initiatives and cooperation and the way nations look at each other? Do you think we are looking at some kind of a paradigm shift?
Yeah, I do think it's far-reaching. There's no doubt about that, and it's been building up. I mean, this is a trend that has been playing out for some years now, and even before the first Trump administration, Trump 1.0. The WTO essentially proved itself not up to the task in being able to continue negotiation of progressive liberalization and creating new rules. So it's not a completely new phenomenon, but it's been building up steam. It certainly was given much more impetus by the first Trump administration, and now with the second Trump administration, it is full bore. In some respects, I think we have a scenario that has parallels with the period between the world wars in the 1930s, in which globalization at that time broke down. High tariffs were applied by the United States and others. There was retaliation. A lot of bilateral trade agreements were done during that time, and it was pretty chaotic. Some analysts would say that was a contributing factor to the start of World War II. But there are parallels, and that's highly disturbing. That said, though, and I'm going to be an optimist here, certainly between the United States and India, I think this is a tremendous opportunity. I've been advocating for this for some time. If the United States and India were to be able to negotiate a far-reaching, comprehensive bilateral trade agreement, that would be a game changer. It certainly would be a game changer economically. The largest economy in the world, soon to be the third largest economy in the world, to become more integrated and provide kind of preferential access in each other's market. That's a huge game changer. But even more strategically, for the US and India to team up that way, they've been doing it certainly increasingly on the defense side. To do it on the economic side would really make a difference, certainly for the likes of China. But I think it would just reinforce the alliance and the potential of the alliance going forward.
What do you think would be the best possible, I wouldn't say consensus, but a best possible outcome that India can hope to have out of this? You kind of touched upon it here and there, but then still I thought of a synopsis.
I mean, most immediately, a tariff deal this week or by early next week that could at least delay imposition of reciprocal tariffs against India. Short of that, a deal that at least would mitigate the magnitude of reciprocal tariffs that could be applied. And this isn't just US-India. This is US and Vietnam, US and the European Union, US and many other countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, which can be competitors with India in the US market. So to be able to strike a deal that might at least lower the impact of tariffs for India, while perhaps higher tariffs are being applied to other countries, could be a benefit. And the most important thing is that they reach an understanding on tariffs and negotiations continue, because this negotiation is going to go far beyond tariffs on the trade front, and they want to keep that going. I mean, it shouldn't get so bad with US reciprocal tariffs and retaliation by India that the broader negotiations don't move forward.
Right. And of course, India's already agreed to a lot of demands from the US, like, for example, buying oil and gas. Then, of course, before that, there were all these agreements on bourbon, whiskey, and bikes and all that. So I think it's quite a possibility that, we could go in for a kind of a deal. But stepping back from India and US, what are the other kind of things that India could probably do to leverage itself? What would you say from how do you view it from where you're sitting? Do you think India could also go in for many other strategic alliances or some kind of deals with other nations or bloc of nations? Not just India for that matter, even any other country, because the whole world is looking at this at a dramatic shift. So what are the kind of maneuverings that different countries can do to protect their interests?
Yeah, well, I think many countries are working very hard, hustling a lot in coming to Washington and trying to have discussions that can lead to individual trade deals with the United States. So India is not alone. I do think India has an advantage over some of those other countries because it's, in some respects, it's first in line. I think Prime Minister Modi's visit within weeks of the inauguration was huge, and their specific agreement to launch a bilateral trade agreement negotiation was huge. And I think the resources now, certainly on the U.S. side, are being directed towards India, and perhaps less so to some of these other countries. I think that we will see, certainly with some countries, we're going to see new tariffs that the U.S. applies, and I think there's some likelihood that some of those countries will retaliate, and then we've got new trade wars, and that's unfortunate. Certainly, to keep the U.S. and India from moving into a trade war is critical. And I'm, as I noted at the outset, I'm optimistic that they can do that they both understand the stakes. But that should be avoided at all costs. And I really think it's a win-win scenario. So much of the analysis of the Trump administration and the president himself is that he's transactional and he sees things in zero-sum terms, that there's a winner and a loser. I don't think that applies so much with India. I think that there's an understanding in the administration that both sides have to win, that India has to gain from this negotiation as well. And certainly in the first Trump administration, and during the first part of that, I was the lead U.S. negotiator. That was understood on the U.S. side, that India has to get something out of this deal for there to be success, for there to be progress in the negotiation. Even though those negotiations eventually broke down, it got very far along. And I think they can benefit from the experience of that first effort during the first Trump administration to negotiate on trade.